The first-class cabin of Alitalia Flight 714 from Rome to Warsaw was unusually quiet that spring morning in 1979. Most passengers were absorbed in their newspapers or dozing comfortably in their wide leather seats. But all that was about to change when a distinguished-looking elderly man in a simple black cassock made his way quietly to his seat, followed by a younger priest carrying a worn briefcase. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. The elderly man moved with a slight limp, a remnant of his years working in a quarry during World War II. His face bore the gentle wrinkles of someone who smiled often, and his eyes carried a depth of wisdom that came from surviving some of history's darkest moments. Few would have guessed that this humble passenger had just finished meeting with world leaders at the Vatican. Richard Sterling, CEO of a prominent American technology company, barely glanced up from his Wall Street Journal as the elderly man settled into the seat across the aisle. Sterling's carefully tailored suit and gold watch marked him as someone accustomed to the finer things in life, someone who viewed first class as his natural habitat. What Sterling didn't know was that the quiet man in the simple black cassock had once faced down Nazi tanks with nothing but his faith, had helped smuggle Jews to safety during the Holocaust, and had played a crucial role in bringing down communist rule in Eastern Europe. The humble priest's worn shoes and unassuming manner gave no hint of his true identity. "Excuse me," Sterling said sharply as the younger priest helped the elderly man arrange his things. "This is the first-class cabin. I believe you might be in the wrong section." His voice carried that particular tone of condescension reserved for those he deemed beneath his station. The younger priest began to speak, but the elderly man gently touched his arm, silencing him with a small smile. "Thank you for your concern," he replied in accented English, his voice warm and gentle. "But I believe we are in the correct seats." Sterling's lips curled into a slight sneer as he took in the simple black clothing and worn shoes. "I find that hard to believe. First-class tickets are quite expensive. Perhaps you got confused during boarding?" The implied insult hung in the air like a challenge. Other passengers had begun to notice the exchange. A woman in a designer suit lowered her magazine, her eyes widening in recognition as she looked at the elderly man. But before she could speak, Sterling continued his tirade. "I don't mean to be rude," he said, meaning exactly that, "but some of us have paid a premium for this cabin precisely to avoid, well, to maintain a certain standard." He gestured vaguely at the priest's simple attire. The elderly man's response was unexpected. He smiled warmly and asked, "And what standard would that be, my son?" The genuine interest in his voice seemed to catch Sterling off guard. Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but his pride pushed him forward. "Well, obviously, a professional standard. A successful standard. Surely you understand that your kind would be more comfortable in economy class." A few gasps could be heard from nearby passengers. The woman with the magazine had pulled out her phone and was typing frantically. The younger priest's face had reddened with anger, but the elderly man remained perfectly calm. "My kind?" he asked, still smiling gently. "And what kind would that be?" Sterling, committed now to his position, pressed on. "You know what I mean. People who clearly can't afford to be here. It diminishes the experience for those of us who can." He straightened his expensive tie as if to emphasize his point. The elderly man nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And this experience, it's very important to you?" "Of course it is," Sterling replied, his voice rising slightly. "I've worked hard to reach a position where I can enjoy certain privileges. I don't expect someone in your position to understand that." The flight attendant approached then, having noticed the commotion. Her face went pale as she recognized the elderly passenger. "Your Holiness," she began, but the man raised his hand slightly, stopping her. Sterling's face showed confusion. "Your Holiness," he scoffed. "What kind of game is this?" The woman with the magazine finally spoke up. "Mr. Sterling, do you know who you're speaking to?" "That's Pope John Paul II. The color drained from Sterling's face as the reality of his situation began to dawn on him. The humble man in the simple black cassock, whom he had just finished insulting, was not only the head of the Catholic Church but one of the most influential leaders in the world. The Pope, however, showed no sign of offense. Instead, he leaned slightly towards Sterling and said quietly, "Perhaps now we can have an interesting discussion about the true meaning of wealth, success, and privilege." His eyes twinkled with what looked surprisingly like amusement. The next few hours would prove to be the most transformative of Richard Sterling's life, though not in any way he could have anticipated when he boarded the flight that morning. The man he had dismissed as unworthy of sharing his cabin space was about to teach him lessons about humility, dignity, and true success that no business school could have offered. The first-class cabin had fallen into a stunned silence. Richard Sterling sat frozen in his seat, his Wall Street Journal forgotten in his lap, as the full weight of his mistake pressed down on him like the altitude outside. Other passengers alternated between staring openly and pretending to be absorbed in their magazines, not wanting to miss a moment of what was unfolding but trying to maintain some semblance of discretion. Pope John Paul II's young assistant, Father Stanislav Dziwisz, had pulled out a small notebook, preparing to give his master some privacy, but the Pope gestured for him to stay. "Stanislav," he said warmly, "I believe this conversation might be educational for all of us." Sterling's throat worked convulsively as he tried to form words. His carefully constructed world of corporate dominance and social superiority had been shattered by a simple title, "Your Holiness." The man he had just finished dismissing as unworthy of first class was perhaps the only person on the plane who had actually earned his seat through true merit rather than mere money. I didn't. Sterling began, but the Pope raised his hand gently. "Let us start again," the Pope said, his accent carrying the warmth of his native Poland. "You were speaking about success and privilege. Please, continue. I am very interested in your perspective." There was no sarcasm in his voice, no hint of triumph or desire to shame. Instead, there was genuine curiosity and what appeared to be real compassion. Sterling glanced desperately around the cabin, perhaps hoping for some escape, but found only attentive faces waiting to hear his response. "Your Holiness, I apologize. I had no idea. I would never have." "That is precisely why we should talk," the Pope interrupted gently. "Because you had no idea who I was, your words came from your heart. They represent what you truly believe about success, about worth, about human dignity. So let us examine these beliefs together." The Pope shifted in his seat to face Sterling more directly. "Tell me about your success. What makes you proud? What gives you satisfaction?" Sterling, thrown off balance by the genuine interest in the question, fell back on his usual script. "Well, I built my company from nothing. Started in my garage, now we employ thousands. Our technology is used worldwide." "Ah," the Pope nodded, "so you understand the value of humble beginnings? Of starting from nothing?" His eyes twinkled with gentle amusement. "I too started in rather humble circumstances. Did you know I once worked as a stonecutter in a quarry?" The other passengers leaned in slightly, drawn into the conversation. Sterling's face showed surprise. "A quarry? But, you're the Pope." "Yes, during the Nazi occupation of Poland. It was hard work, but honorable work. Every morning, I would join my fellow workers, Jews, Catholics, believers and non-believers alike. We all sweated the same, bled the same." The Pope's voice carried no bitterness, only reflection. "It taught me something valuable about human dignity. Would you like to know what that was?" Sterling nodded mutely, his expensive tie suddenly feeling too tight. "I learned that true worth has nothing to do with what we wear, or where we sit, or how much money we have in our accounts. It has everything to do with how we treat others, especially those we think can do nothing for us in return." A flight attendant approached with drinks, her hands trembling slightly as she served the Pope a simple glass of water. He thanked her by name, asking about her family, showing the same interest he would show to a head of state. But success is real, Sterling protested weakly. Achievement matters. Status. Ah, status, the Pope interrupted gently. Let me tell you about status. In 1944, I gave last rites to dying soldiers in the Warsaw Uprising. Some were Germans, some were Poles. In death, all their status stripped away, they were simply children of God. Their expensive uniforms or shabby civilian clothes meant nothing in that moment. Sterling's face had lost its arrogant mask, replaced by something more vulnerable. I've worked hard for everything I have, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. As have I, the Pope replied. Though perhaps we measure achievement differently. Tell me, Mr. Sterling, what will you be remembered for? When your time comes, what will matter most? Your first-class seats or your first-class deeds? The cabin had grown so quiet that the hum of the engines seemed loud in comparison. Other passengers had abandoned any pretense of not listening, completely absorbed in the impromptu lesson in humanity taking place at 30,000 feet. Your technology company, the Pope continued, you said it employs thousands. This is good. But do you know their names? Their struggles? Their hopes? Do you see them as costs on a spreadsheet or as human beings created in God's image? Sterling shifted uncomfortably. It's not possible to know everyone personally in a large corporation. No, perhaps not all. But it is possible to treat all with dignity. To create policies that reflect the value of human life above profit. To remember that every person, whether they clean your offices or sit on your board, carries within them the same divine spark. The Pope reached into his worn briefcase and pulled out a small, tattered book. This is my old prayer book from my days in the quarry. See how worn it is. Each mark, each tear represents a moment of hardship, yes, but also of growth. Sometimes our greatest achievements come disguised as our greatest struggles. Sterling stared at the book, its weathered pages telling a story so different from the leather-bound quarterly reports that filled his office. I've never thought about success that way, he admitted. Few do, until something causes them to see differently, the Pope said kindly. Would you like to know what I consider my greatest success? The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his answer. It is not becoming Pope, though I am honored to serve. It is not the books I have written or the speeches I have given. My greatest success is each time I help someone see their own worth and the worth of others. Sometimes, Mr. Sterling, our most important achievements are the moments when we choose to be humble instead of proud, kind instead of important. A baby started crying somewhere in the back of first class, and the mother looked mortified, especially given her proximity to the Pope. But John Paul II simply smiled and made a gentle blessing gesture toward the child. Even the smallest among us have dignity, he said. Even those who cannot afford first-class tickets. The irony of his words was not lost on Sterling, who had the grace to blush deeply. The Pope noticed his discomfort and patted his arm gently. Do not be ashamed of your success, Mr. Sterling. Be ashamed only if you let it blind you to the success of others, even when it looks different from your own. Father Xywis had been quietly taking notes, perhaps recognizing that this impromptu lesson would find its way into a future homily. The Pope noticed and smiled. Stanislav knows I often find God's lessons in unexpected places. Today, perhaps, he arranged this seating assignment for all our benefits. Sterling looked down at his expensive watch, the status symbol suddenly seeming less significant. Your Holiness, I don't know how to apologize enough for my behavior. Then don't apologize, the Pope said simply. Change. That is the only apology that matters. When you return to your company, look at your employees differently. When you board your next flight, see your fellow passengers differently. Success without compassion is no success at all. As the flight continued over the European countryside, the first-class cabin had transformed into something resembling an intimate parish hall. The Pope's presence and his interaction with Sterling had broken down the usual barriers that kept first-class passengers in their own isolated bubbles of privilege. Sterling's expensive suit no longer seemed to sit quite right on his shoulders. He found himself doing something he had never done on a flight before, actually looking at the people around him. The flight attendant's name tag read Maria, and he noticed for the first time how tired she looked, yet she maintained her professional smile. "Your Holiness," Sterling said, his voice having lost its earlier arrogance, "you mentioned the Warsaw Uprising. Would you tell us more about that time?" The request surprised even him. When was the last time he had asked someone about their past without an ulterior motive? The Pope's eyes grew distant for a moment, gazing out at the clouds below. It was a time when the true measure of wealth became very clear. Those who had much often lost everything, while those who seemed to have nothing gave everything they had to help others. He described how, as a young priest, he had witnessed both the worst and best of humanity. "I saw wealthy men share their last piece of bread with strangers. I saw poor women risk their lives to hide Jewish children. The labels we put on people, rich, poor, important, common, they all disappeared in the face of our shared humanity." A businessman across the aisle, who had been pretending to work on his laptop while listening intently, closed his computer. But how do we maintain that perspective in today's world? In business, everything is about metrics, numbers, status. The Pope smiled. But who creates these metrics? Who decides what we measure? Perhaps we are measuring the wrong things. He turned to Sterling. "In your company, how do you measure success?" Sterling answered automatically, "Quarterly profits, market share, stock price." He trailed off, suddenly hearing how hollow these words sounded. "And what of human profit?" the Pope asked. "What of the growth in dignity, in compassion, in community? Are these not also measures of true success?" The cabin had grown quiet again, several passengers taking out notebooks or phones to write down his words. A young executive in the back removed his expensive tie, as if somehow it had become uncomfortable. Father Xywis shared a knowing look with his master. They had seen this transformation before, this moment when people began to see beyond their material success to something deeper. Sterling found himself sharing things he had never told anyone. "I started my company wanting to create something meaningful. Somewhere along the way, it became about the next quarter, the next acquisition, the next status symbol." He gestured at his gold watch. "I can't remember the last time I asked about my employees' lives, their families." The Pope reached into his worn briefcase again, this time pulling out a simple wooden rosary. "See this? It was given to me by a poor woman in Krakow when I was a young priest. She had nothing else to give, but she wanted to share her faith, her hope. It is worth more to me than any golden chain." A flight attendant approached with lunch service, her hands still shaking slightly as she served the Pope. He noticed her nervousness and asked, "Maria, do you have children?" Startled at being addressed directly, she nodded. "To, Your Holiness. My boy is sick, actually. That's why I picked up extra shifts." Before the Pope could respond, Sterling interrupted, "What airline is this? Who's your supervisor?" The old arrogance had crept back into his voice. The other passengers tensed, but the Pope remained calm, watching. Maria's face paled. "Sir, No, I need to know," Sterling insisted, pulling out his phone. "Because no employee should have to work extra shifts to cover their child's medical care. This is exactly what corporate healthcare policies should be for." He looked at the Pope. "That is what you meant, isn't it? About seeing people differently?" The Pope's smile was warm with approval. "You begin to understand, my son. Every interaction is an opportunity to show dignity, to create justice." Other passengers began sharing their own stories. A woman talked about her company's new daycare center. A young executive admitted he had never learned the names of his maintenance staff. The cabin became a confessional of corporate culture, with the Pope listening patiently to each revelation. Sterling found himself taking notes, not on his phone or tablet, but on the simple airline napkin, writing with a borrowed pen. Ideas flowed: employee healthcare reform, daycare facilities, education programs. The business metrics he had lived by for so long began to transform into human metrics. "But Your Holiness," he asked, "how do we balance profit with these human needs?" "The shareholders." "Ah, shareholders," the Pope interrupted gently. "Tell me, what shares do we hold in each other's humanity? What dividends does compassion pay? These are not separate ledgers, Mr. Sterling. A company that values human dignity will find its profits are not just monetary." Father Xywis had been quietly observing the transformation taking place. He had seen his master work similar changes in politicians, diplomats, and world leaders. But this conversion of a corporate titan at 30,000 feet was something special. The Pope continued, "In the quarry, I learned that the strongest stone is not the most expensive, but the one that bears the most weight for others. Perhaps companies are the same, their true strength lies not in their market value, but in their value to human dignity." A young woman in business attire spoke up from her seat. "I've been working on Wall Street for 5 years, trying to prove myself. Today is the first time I've thought about what I'm trying to prove, and to whom." The conversation continued to deepen, touching on themes of corporate responsibility, human dignity, and the true meaning of success. The Pope listened more than he spoke, allowing each person to discover their own path to understanding. Sterling looked at his phone again, but this time not to check stocks or emails. He pulled up his company's organization chart. "I've never even met most of these people," he admitted. "I don't know their stories, their struggles, their triumphs." "Then that is where your new journey begins," the Pope said. "Every name on that chart is not just an employee, they are someone's child, someone's parent, someone's hope. When we begin to see people this way, our decisions change, our priorities shift." The flight attendant returned with fresh water for the Pope. This time her hands were steady, and she smiled genuinely. Sterling noticed how the Pope thanked her by name again, asked about her son, promised to keep the boy in his prayers. It was a masterclass in human dignity, delivered through the simplest of interactions. As the flight continued, the first-class cabin had become something else entirely, a place of reflection, of revelation, of transformation. The invisible barriers between passengers had dissolved, replaced by genuine conversation and connection. Sterling looked out the window at the clouds below, his world irrevocably changed. The Pope's words echoed in his mind: "Success without compassion is no success at all." He began to see his life's work in a new light, not as a path to personal wealth and status, but as a platform for creating positive change in the lives of others. As the Alitalia flight began its descent into Warsaw, the transformation that had taken place in the first-class cabin was palpable. Richard Sterling sat quietly, the napkin covered with his notes clutched in his hand like a precious document. The Pope's words had planted seeds that would grow into something far more significant than anyone on that flight could have imagined. "Before we land," the Pope said, turning to Sterling one last time, "let me share with you a story from my days as a parish priest. There was a wealthy businessman, much like yourself, who came to confession. He listed his sins of pride, of greed, of treating others as beneath him. But his greatest sin, he realized, was not what he had done, but what he had failed to do with the power he possessed." Sterling leaned forward, absorbing every word. "What happened to him?" "He used his position to become a force for good. His factory became known not just for its products, but for how it treated its workers. He discovered that profit and compassion could coexist, that success could be measured in smiles as well as in zloty, our Polish currency." The Pope smiled. The impact of the flight began to manifest even before they landed. Sterling had already drafted emails to his board of directors on his phone, proposing sweeping changes to company policy. The woman from Wall Street had written a resignation letter, not to leave finance, but to start a consultancy focusing on ethical investment. As the plane touched down in Warsaw, something unprecedented happened. The first-class passengers, who normally rushed to be first off the plane, remained seated, allowing the Pope to disembark first. But he paused, turning to address them one final time. "Remember this flight," he said softly. "Remember that true first class is not about where we sit, but how we treat those around us. Mr. Sterling, your journey begins now. Make it count." The aftermath of that flight would ripple through the corporate world in ways no one could have predicted. Sterling returned to his company a changed man. His first action was to call an all-hands meeting, not via video conference, but in person. He visited every major office, learning names, listening to stories, understanding the human side of his corporate empire. Within 6 months, Sterling Technologies had implemented groundbreaking changes. The company instituted comprehensive healthcare coverage for all employees, including part-time workers. On-site daycare centers were established. A profit-sharing program was created that included every employee, from executives to janitors. The business press was skeptical at first. Analysts predicted doom, shareholders threatened to revolt. But something unexpected happened. Employee productivity soared. Turnover dropped to industry-low levels. Innovation increased as workers, now feeling valued and secure, contributed ideas that transformed the company. Maria, the flight attendant from that fateful flight, received a surprise one day. Sterling had tracked down her airline's CEO and worked to establish a partnership for employee healthcare coverage. Her son received the treatment he needed, and the policy was extended to all airline staff. The story of the flight eventually leaked to the media. CEO's divine intervention, read the headlines. Sterling didn't shy away from sharing his experience. He became a sought-after speaker, not on technology or business strategy, but on corporate compassion and human dignity in the workplace. Father Dziwisz, in his memoirs years later, would write about that flight as one of many examples of how Pope John Paul II could transform lives through simple conversations. The Pope himself kept the airline napkin with Sterling's notes, having asked for it before they landed. He would occasionally show it to other business leaders who visited the Vatican. The young executive who had removed his tie during the flight went on to start a movement called Humanity in Business, bringing together corporate leaders who wanted to balance profit with purpose. The Wall Street Woman's ethical investment firm became a major force in promoting corporate responsibility. Sterling's company became a case study in business schools, but not for the reasons he would have once hoped. Instead of being lauded for market dominance or technological innovation, it was studied for its revolutionary approach to corporate culture and human dignity in the workplace. 5 years after the flight, Sterling was invited to speak at a conference in Rome. Before his presentation, he visited the Vatican, carrying with him a simple wooden box. Inside was his old gold watch, which he had stopped wearing the day of the flight. He requested that it be auctioned for charity, with the proceeds going to support worker education programs. The Pope's lessons continued to influence Sterling's decisions. When faced with the option to automate hundreds of jobs, he instead created a retraining program. When a competitor offered to buy his company for a premium, he made employee protection a non-negotiable condition of the sale. The flight attendant, Maria, became a symbol of the change one conversation could create. She was promoted to manage the airline's new employee welfare program, implementing many of the ideas born on that flight to Warsaw. Her son, fully recovered, would later intern at Sterling Technologies. Business magazines began publishing annual Dignity Index rankings, measuring companies not just by their profits but by their treatment of employees, community impact, and ethical practices. Sterling Technologies consistently ranked at the top, inspiring other corporations to follow suit. The transformation extended beyond just one company. Other CEOs, hearing Sterling's story, began their own journeys of corporate consciousness. Boardrooms across the world started asking different questions, not just, how much profit, but, at what human cost? The Pope's words about success being measured in human terms became a mantra in business schools. A new generation of business leaders emerged, trained not just in finance and strategy, but in human dignity and corporate compassion. Sterling kept the airline napkin with his notes, having made a copy for the Pope. It hung framed in his office, not as a symbol of pride but as a reminder of humility. Under it, he placed a simple quote, "Success without compassion is no success at all." The woman who had been bound for Wall Street transformed her sector of the financial industry. Her firm specialized in identifying companies that balanced profit with human dignity, creating a new category of ethical investment that would grow to billions of dollars. Years later, when asked about his greatest achievement, Sterling would point not to his company's stock price or market share, but to the daycare center where employees' children played, to the education program that had helped thousands advance their careers, to the healthcare system that had saved lives. The Pope's influence continued long after that flight. His message about human dignity in business became part of his broader teachings, referenced in speeches and encyclicals. The Warsaw Flight, as it became known, was cited as a perfect example of how personal encounter could lead to systemic change. Sterling never flew first class again. Instead, he chose to sit in economy, talking with people, learning their stories, understanding their lives. His employees noted that he had developed a habit of learning everyone's names, just as the Pope had done with the flight attendant. The final validation came a decade after the flight, when Sterling Technologies was featured in a Harvard Business Review study. The conclusion was clear: companies that prioritized human dignity alongside profit consistently outperformed their peers. The Pope's lesson about compassion paying dividends had proven prophetically true. As Sterling neared retirement, he established a foundation focused on promoting human dignity in corporate practices. Its symbol was a simple yellow airline napkin, and its mission statement included the words he had heard at 30,000 feet, "True worth has nothing to do with what we wear, or where we sit, or how much money we have in our accounts. It has everything to do with how we treat others." The legacy of that flight continues to influence corporate culture today. In boardrooms and business schools, the story is told as a reminder that true success is measured not in currency, but in human terms. And somewhere in the Vatican archives, a simple airline napkin remains, bearing the first notes of a corporate revolution born in the first-class cabin of Flight 714.